Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And today we're very honored to welcome as a special guest, political economist, former Reagan administration official, Paul Craig Roberts. He needs no introduction to Gagglers. Everyone's very familiar with his innumerable writings. He's written many books. He's also been a prolific columnist. And I should say that I first met Paul back in the 1980s when I worked at the Times Literary Supplement. I was an editor there. And Paul was one of my reviewers that I regularly sought out. And he wrote excellent reviews on a regular basis. But, you know, when I was disappeared from the TLS, I think, unfortunately, Paul's was also disappeared.
George, all of us have been disappeared from
exactly.
at one point in time.
Exactly. But what I think more recently, Paul has been writing rather critical articles about Russia's progress in the war in Ukraine. He's dissented from many of the writers, many of whom have also appeared on the Gaggle, and because Paul has taken a somewhat jaundiced, pessimistic view of the progress Russia has made and the strategy underlying Russia's so-called special military operations. So perhaps, Paul, you could start off and explain what your issue is and why things have developed in the way they have.
Well, I think it was a miscalculation by the Kremlin and by President Putin to have a long, drawn-out, half-fought conflict, because it gave time for Washington and NATO to get involved. And we have seen, as time has passed, they have gotten increasingly involved, heavier and heavier. And steps that they previously disavowed, they've now gone ahead and taken. And so the consequence of this drawn-out affair, which seems to be purposeless in any real sense, is to get the West so committed to the conflict that it will be difficult for them to let go. And so if the Russians ever do decide to use sufficient force to bring the conflict to an end, we risk Washington and NATO committing troops. Washington has 20,000 troops deployed in Romania, apparently ready for the conflict. And there are numerous reports, which may or may not be true, that Poland has amassed an army that's ready for intervention. So what we see from the long, drawn-out process, we're now well into the second year, is that the conflict widens, it ever widens. We see the defeat of Putin's original aims, which was to be sure there was no NATO in Ukraine that close to Moscow. So he doesn't have that yet, but he now has NATO in Finland close to Moscow. And apparently there will be NATO in Sweden. And so this whole slow, drawn-out process looks to me to be a major defeat for Putin's original aims, which were limited to driving the Ukrainians out of Donbass, where they were threatening to essentially exterminate the population, the Russian population. So another con to Putin's approach is that it has created in the West, due to all the Western propaganda, the impression that Russia really isn't a very formidable military entity, that it can't even defeat a worn-out Ukrainian army, and that we really shouldn't have much fear or respect for Russian military. And so this creates even more arrogant positions in the West. So it looks to me like a disaster. What Putin needed to do was to very quickly win that conflict before the West had time to get involved. I can't understand how such a strategic blunder could be made. And I don't understand how any person involved in war doesn't understand the importance of getting it over with as quick as you can, particularly when you have the force to end it. I think what would have stunned the world, and certainly probably would have broken up NATO, had been if the Kremlin had simply knocked out Ukraine in a week. Just the whole thing, dead in the water, stopped. It would have sent the fear of God throughout NATO. No NATO country has an army that's capable of going to war. It would have stunned the American neoconservatives. They would not be so arrogant and sure of themselves that they can buffalo Russia. But that opportunity was missed. And instead, we've had now, 14 months of...
How do you explain why do you think it was missed? Why did Putin conduct this kind of strategy?
I don't
Well,
know.
I'll weigh in on that here, and I think that we've just heard some sound reasoning, but I think there's also alternative theories to the case, and the most important one is yes. I mean, I think all of us thought this was going to be over very, very quickly. That was what most people thought, but that would have entailed something that Russia has wanted to avoid and has avoided, and that is to occupy a large population against its will. And this is something that they are very, very sensitive about. They don't want to be occupiers. And if you look at the four regions that have been inducted into Russia since the advent of the conflict, you don't have civil disobedience. You don't have a terror, a fifth column terrorist group and things like that. This is what they want to avoid here. Now, one can make the argument, and many have come and to talk to George and I here on the Gaggle, is that the Ukrainian army was defeated last summer. Now it is a NATO army. Okay, and so I can see that point here, but I still think that the goal is to destroy NATO in any kind of meaningful sense. As George and I have said in the past, rather jokingly, turn it into a supper club. Okay, because that's why this is going to be a long slog, is that there's going to be emphatically and categorically going to demilitarize Ukraine for time moving forward. Okay, there's not going to be a cessation and there'll be a ceasefire. No, that doesn't solve Russia's security problems.
But
okay?
no, I think, but Peter, just that's the goal. That obviously is the goal. But it's one thing to want this, another thing to achieve it. I mean, yeah, ideally demilitarize, get rid of Zelensky and his gang, all the neo-Nazis and the Banderistas. But Russia doesn't seem particularly close to achieving any of those goals. So anyway, what do you think, Paul?
Well, I agree that what Peter says is a likely fact. But what it overlooks is the long drawn-out process lets the West get involved and builds the West's confidence that it can militarily confront Russia, and that NATO can. So that's the downside. But I also think that Russia could have ended this with no need to occupy Ukraine. All they had to do was to knock out all of power generation, all water generation, all public transport, roads, bridges, train stations. And they could have done that from a distance with their very successful missiles. And this would have simply closed down Ukraine's ability to conduct a war. And they deprived
that also would have closed down Ukraine. And
right.
I think this is one of the big problems here, is that I live in the neighborhood. Okay, I'm close by. Actually, George is too. Okay, it's in no one's interest, not in Russia's interest, to have a completely utterly failed state on its border. Considering one more thing, considering the high levels of criminality that Ukraine is known for, so it could become much more dangerous. a terror state. And of course, the neocons in Washington would probably go along with it, okay? And this is what we heard from the very beginning, create a new Afghanistan for the Russians. That the Russians won't walk into that trap, even if it takes a long time to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
Well, I understand this argument, Peter, but I think that it's mistaken in the sense that if Russia gets into a conflict and it's unwilling to end before it convinces the West to commit to it, it's got a much greater problem. It has the problem of nuclear war. And I think the problem of nuclear war is much greater than the problem of whether Ukraine becomes a criminal state. My own opinion is that nobody can function in any manner if they've got no power, no water, no public transportation, no roads. This would have stopped the war almost immediately, would have forced a capitulation, and then the Russians could have allowed the rebuilding, but the Zelensky government would no longer exist. And clearly the Russians would control what government was there to bring about the restoration. So I still think that though
Exactly. I mean, if it had to be in the United States, that's what they would have done. I mean, shock and awe is the way the United States fights its wars. I mean, it just launches it, and you know, it destroyed Iraq's army. I mean, Iraq's army was destroyed very quickly. Now, you can then say, yeah, but what happens then? And of course, that's a different issue about how do you run a country after you've destroyed its army. But nonetheless, a military victory was accomplished. I mean, the Americans did accomplish a military victory in Iraq.
But they want a political victory, George. They want a political victory.
No, I agree.
I'm sorry, and a security victory. Okay, gentlemen, what you're saying is obvious. Yes, they could have turned it into a moonscape. But there's another element here, and George and I have been talking about this almost 3 times a week for over 14 months now. One of the big problems here is that George brought up shock and awe in Iraq. He's absolutely correct on that. But Ukraine is not Iraq. And that would be something that in Russia would be unconscionable. I like to remind people there are cousins and uncles and aunties and grandpas. You know, as much as the Zelensky crowd with the backing of the West wants to say these are completely different, discrete, different countries and peoples, it's just not true. Okay, and that is something public opinion is very careful about here. That's why when we had for 8 years the conflict in Donbass, is that Western audiences had no idea that the people in the Donbass were actually angry with the Russians for not doing more to help them, okay? Right. Because they're family, they're brethren. And so this calculation of shock and awe, again, I'll go back, maybe over time, more and more people, because they don't want to see their sons die, they don't want to see Ukraine completely annihilated, because
but in a way that's
the next day we have to deal with the consequences.
Yes, but no, you're right. But the problem is that you've got that now. I mean, if the numbers are true, how many have died on both sides, then you're talking about a stunning loss of life. And if your idea was we need to save Ukrainian lives, and if we need to maintain the common Russian world and so on, well, how many hundreds of thousands are now dead on both sides? These are young Ukrainian men are now dead, you know, so they're not going to have children and so on. So you haven't really accomplished that, which supposedly you're doing, which is to save lives and, you know, have a fraternal relationship between two brother countries. Anyway, Paul, what do you think?
I think you're both right.
Yeah, that's the problem. We're all right.
I myself have stressed the reluctance of the Kremlin to do too much damage to Ukraine because of the intermarriages and the, you know, Ukraine has been part of Russia for centuries. It's only been an independent country for about 30 years, right? So you know, it's part of Russia, and that's true. But still, I come back to the inherent danger of an ever-widening war. And once you have a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, then you're talking about probably the extermination of all life, not just Ukrainians. And this is the risk that I have been concerned about, that the slow, drawn-out process, which has created the impression that Russia is a weak military force and can't even defeat a third world army, has made the American neoconservatives more and more sure of themselves, more arrogant, more determined to bring down Russia. What you have to remember, the basis of all this trouble is the neoconservative war doctrine. It's the dominant doctrine. It determines American foreign policy, and it states that the principal purpose of American foreign policy is to prevent the rise of any power that could serve as a constraint on U.S. unilateralism. So this is why we have the antagonism against Russia and China, because both countries are clearly powerful enough to serve as a constraint. And so everyone needs to understand that the purpose of the neoconservatives who control American foreign policy, not just the discussion in the journals and all of that, but the actual implementation. They hold a post in the National Security Council, the State Department, the Pentagon. They are the ones making the policy. And what has happened is they have become more secure in their belief that they can somehow move Russia aside, and that Russia is really a paper tiger, and that it is their goal, their purpose is to somehow defeat Russia. So when you have that kind of an attitude, and it's reinforced by what they interpret as Russian military failure, you get more and more American involvement. And we've seen it, haven't we? First, they said there'll be no long-range missiles. Well, then we send long-range missiles. There'll be no tanks. We send tanks. There'll be no jet fighters. Well, now we're debating sending F-16s.
But none of those things have changed the calculus on the ground.
I'm not talking about, Peter, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the escalation of American involvement. This is the way it happened in Vietnam. The next thing is troops. And then they say, oh, 50,000 more troops and we'll do it. And you end up with 500,000. And this is the way we get into wars. And it's not, I'm not talking about shock and awe. And furthermore, the Russians had a legitimate reason for intervening in Ukraine. The United States did not have a legitimate reason for interfering in Iraq. It was mainly done for Israel. The purpose was to prevent the Hezbollah militia in southern Lebanon from being financed and provided with weapons by Iraq, Syria, and Iran, so that Israel could finally move in and take the water resources in southern Lebanon. This was the reason for the Iraq invasion. They dressed it up with lies about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, which all the weapons inspectors said they did not have. They sent the Secretary of State to the UN to lie through his teeth, and this is no comparison to the situation in Donbass. So it's not shock and awe. It's that they made a decision to intervene in a way that they had not considered all of the consequences. They didn't consider the long drawn out propaganda that it gave the West to control the narrative and demonize Russia and Putin. They didn't consider the buildup of confidence in the West by the drawn out war that couldn't come to a conclusion. And they didn't consider that the implication of this is a more likely confrontation directly between the two superpowers. And we've already had Lavrov say several times, and other Russian officials, both in the Duma and in the National Security Council, Russia's counterpart, that we are in effect at war with NATO. We are in a war. Where they've said that there's now direct involvement with the Americans because they provide targeting information to the Ukrainians. They provide military intelligence, and that the Americans are actually involved. They're actively involved. Well, this is the danger. You see, where does that stop? I mean, that's the danger, and that's my concern. And so,
yeah, I agree with you, but there's no turning back. Okay, if, the West said that it didn't want to go down these paths of escalation. They have, and Russia has met them in their own way, in their own time. That is something that has frustrated George a great deal on our podcast, and rightfully so. It's a fair argument. But there's going to be no negotiated end to this. Those days are gone. We had that with the Turks mediating. We had the the former Israeli prime minister confirm that to us. There's no turning back, and I don't see that. Again, going ceasefire. Why? To do it all over again in 5 years or 10 years? The Russians will not let that happen, and they will. Unfortunately, it looks like they're willing to continue on the path that they are at great cost. But the outcome will be definitive.
Right, but this is.
I'm sorry, if the Poles want to send an army into Ukraine, then it will be destroyed.
But as we've discussed again many times here on the Gaggle, neither side can step off. The United States now isn't going to accept total defeat in Ukraine. I mean, it cannot happen. They're not just going to walk away.
You see, this is again, we go into the discursive gimmicks that we have. Remember, well, Putin didn't make it to Paris. We won. We don't put it past these people, George. I'm sorry,
Peter. I'm not talking about negotiations or peace talks. I think Putin has said many times that we can't trust anybody in the West. So I wouldn't understand why Russia would hold any kind of agreement with Washington. They've already said they can't trust them. We've had the revelations about the Minsk Accord that was a trick to deceive Putin. So I'm not talking about that, and I'm just simply saying that things have a tendency to spiral out of control, and that the way that the Kremlin is conducting this is encouraging it to spiral further out of control. The fact that the Kremlin can defeat the tanks and the missiles and the airplanes if they come, it doesn't mean that these are not escalations and that there won't be another step. And when we have the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who got the whole trouble in the Ukraine started in the first place, when we have her saying that Ukraine should have missiles that they can use to attack Russia herself, this is scary. This is real. What's going to happen if one of these things hits Moscow? I mean, they're talking about taking back Crimea. Well, can you imagine the Russians giving up the Black Sea naval base? I can't. And so, but when they talk about these things, it must mean they have it in mind and that they think it could be done. And this is the dangers that I stress. And I think that these dangers were not fully appreciated by the Kremlin's approach to its intervention.
How do you see the immediate future now? Do you think there will be a Ukrainian offensive to cut the land bridge to Crimea in Zaporozhye? Do you think it's in the near future?
Not unless the Kremlin lets them.
Right. Well, I guess
the question, George, is, where's the Russian army? As far as I can tell, it's not present on the scene. The whole war has been fought by the Wagner Group and the Donbass militias, and the Wagner Group is some sort of private military organization. And recently, its leader has been complaining that the Kremlin is stiffing them on arms, that they don't have enough artillery shells or whatever. And the Donbass militias, these are relatively small because that area is not big, and they've been fighting now for how many years? I mean, they've got to be depleted. And so the question is, what kind of intervention is this? Where's the Russian army? Is there one? Does Russia have an army? Where is it? Clearly, if there's a Russian army presence, there's not going to be any Ukrainian offensive. How could they possibly move against a Russian army? It's not conceivable. I don't think it's conceivable that the United States could move against a Russian army or NATO. I mean, NATO is it's a paper structure. And
Well,
the other
said
day,
earlier,
the German minister said, we don't have enough weapons for our own army. We can't send any more to Ukraine.
well, I mean, one of the interesting things, what the perception here, about the Ukrainian military. Well, at the start of the conflict, it had a very sizable, well-armed, I don't know how well trained, but certainly moneyed by the United States and NATO countries. I mean, they wanted this plucky little Ukraine. Well, no, it was extremely well armed. And it was defeated in the battlefield, and then NATO took its place. And that is a counter argument. One day we may find out is that the special military operation technically was a success there. Ukraine was supposed to make concessions and have the conflict wind down. Boris Johnson intervened and said, no, you're not finished yet. And that changed the calculus completely, okay?
Right, but that should have been...
I mean, one thing to follow up, where's the Russian army? I can tell you both. They don't want young men killed. If the Wagner Group wants to do that, okay, and that's what they're paid to do, that's fine. The question is, where is the Russian army? Well, maybe, hopefully, we'll find that out relatively soon. Because why do you have this partial mobilization? I mean, just to keep people under arms doesn't make any sense to me. So I think over the next few months, and I know, George, I've been saying over the next few months for a long time, okay, before you chime in, but I think that's a fair question. Where is the Russian army? That's fair.
No, I think so. And yes, I mean, Russia can call on, it's a much bigger country than Ukraine. It can call on, it has much more manpower to call on. But actually in Ukraine itself, Ukraine outnumbers the Russians. There are more Ukrainians fighting in Ukraine than there are Russians. So Russia doesn't have any numerical advantage in Ukraine, which is why it's not able to bring the war to a conclusion. I mean, you still win wars by having overwhelming force, overwhelming numbers of infantry, overwhelming numbers of tanks, artillery, everything. That's how you win. I mean, you don't win by attritional warfare or, limited special military operations. Anyway, Paul, what do you think?
Well, I would just add to where I think Putin made mistakes. In 2014, when the United States overthrew the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian government that came in began harassing and murdering and bombing and shelling Donbass. The Donbass, the two independent republics, self-declared, made the same request of Russia as Crimea. They said, take us back. We're traditionally Russian. We're part of Russia. We were stuck here by communist leaders in the Soviet period, and we want to come home. And he refused. This was a strategic mistake.
And he's essentially even admitted that since then. Yeah. Yes.
And then he compounded this by waiting 8 years while the United States and the British trained the Ukrainian army. Trying to keep Donbass in Ukraine by giving it some forms of autonomy so it couldn't be persecuted by police and so on. Well, why spend 8 years doing something when you see your opponent building up an army? Clearly, they're not going to obey Minsk. Why did, it looked to me like the power of people in Russia who want to be part of the West were a powerful constraint on Putin's ability to act. And I've thought that these pro-American Russians, which I think inhibit the upper classes and the business classes, we're simply preventing Russia from protecting its interests. Now, I think their influence appears to dwindle substantially, but it's left the situation in a bad fix for the Kremlin. And I think that what has to happen, the only thing that can really fundamentally change the conditions, in my opinion, that are leading toward nuclear war is for Russia simply to quickly knock out Ukraine, establish a government. That means Kiev, that means everything. Establish a government in Kiev and declare the conflict over. And seal the borders against the West. It would have to be sealed borders against the West, expulsion. And that would then send a message that, these people are determined and serious after all, and maybe we misread it and we don't want to push anymore because the next thing you know, we're not here. It's going to take, in my opinion, now, a really decisive action by the Russians to stop this spiraling toward nuclear war. Otherwise, it's going to keep, at some point, there are red lines that the Kremlin can't accept. So far, they've not enforced any of their red lines. They declare them and they get violated and they do nothing about it. And this encourages more crossing of red lines, more disregard that there's a Russian response. And that makes it more and more dangerous that we push too hard. At some point, the neoconservatives are just too confident. And then is when you lose control. Nobody has control at that point. And you have to remember too, in the Cold War days, I was very much involved in the Cold War. In the Cold War days, both governments had been working together and during this period to reduce tensions. You had the Soviets and American presidents working on arms limitation. They were talking together. They were trying to reduce tensions because there were so many false alarms from warning systems. Both sides would receive incoming missiles. Well, because both sides were working together so hard to reduce tensions, nobody believed the incoming signals. Well, now the tensions are shattered. I mean, we never had tensions as high as we have today during the Cold War, not even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm not the only one that says this. Lots of people are saying this. Scott Ritter recently repeated it. So today, all it takes is one false warning. It's going to be believed. And not only that, the missiles now are much closer, or they're much, the Russian ones that travel at supersonic speeds. And if we have missiles on ships in the Black Sea and they've got them off our coast, I mean, you're talking about 3, 4, 5 minutes. There's no decision time. There's no time to check. Is this a false alarm? This is a highly dangerous situation. It's just from accidental war. We never had such a serious situation. But what the American governments have done since Clinton is go back on every agreement, every promise. Washington has broken every agreement. There's no longer any arms limitation agreements. They're all gone. The SALT agreements are gone. The anti-ballistic missile is gone. The intermediate range missiles are gone. Everything is gone. There's no contact. There's no discussion. Neither side trusts the other. This is a highly dangerous situation. And this is a situation that we should be talking about and trying to deal with, not the tactics or in Ukraine or what. But it's a it's risky beyond, I call it a nanosecond to midnight, a nanosecond to Armageddon. The nuclear scientists, have the doomsday clock. They keep moving it up. They say it's 90 seconds. Scott Ritter says it's half a second. I say it's a nanosecond. It only takes one mistake and the world's gone. And this is what we face, and this has to somehow be reconciled. And it's going to be difficult. I mean, even if Putin is willing to take that kind of leadership role, it's going to be difficult because the Kremlin is convinced the neoconservatives that Russia's a paper tiger. And this is a huge danger. It's a massive danger. There has to be something happens to convince the people running American foreign policy that Russia's not a paper tiger, and that
well, if let's say there was a shock and awe to take out command and control in Kiev, which a lot of people in Russia are very impatient to see finally happen, particularly with this murder of this blogger journalist in St. Petersburg. Do you think that is a possible trigger? Because for a Western reaction, because the way what I worry about most, and it's an echo of what you've just said here, is that I worry most about a false flag operation trying to induce the Russians to react with its entire repertoire of weaponry, and because that's the only kind of thing now from the Western perspective where they can shake up the mix of what's going on in Ukraine. Other than that, the slog goes on. They lose 500 troops a day. It continues to go on. Russians lose troops as well. But from what I can tell, the body count is much higher for the Ukrainians. And the only thing that's going to shake it up is if there is a sudden move by the West, because they see the writing on the wall. It is a war of attrition, and the West is losing.
I just want to quickly add on to that, is that I don't think Washington thinks it's losing. That's why I think this. I've seen no evidence of that. I mean, I disagree. Okay, we disagree on that, because I think that Ukraine will launch an offensive in the coming weeks, and that may or may not be successful. But we saw that the Kherson offensive was successful. We saw the one at Kharkov was successful. So if this offensive is successful, then I think there's going to be very big changes afoot. Who knows then what happens? But I wouldn't put it past the Ukraine, and the Americans are very much encouraging them to do this, that this might be a successful offensive. Anyway, Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, but what they want is something to happen. Even if the Ukrainians are slaughtered, they want something to happen. And that is part of their possible future off ramp. Okay.
But I just don't think that.
Paul, George and I have been doing this for almost a year and a half.
I can tell.
I apologize on our both of us. Go ahead.
Well, look, I think Peter's point is well taken, and it is one possibility. However, I think what's wrong, or what Peter's point overlooks, is that a decisive Russian action, such as shutting down Kiev and dictating the end of the war, this would shake the neocons' confidence. And that's what needs to happen. It's not going to cause them to get more confidence and say, oh, now we can really attack Russia. It's going to make them say, oh, my God, we were wrong. And if we don't shake the neocons' confidence, they're going to keep on this track they're on, which is ever widening the war. Look how much it's widened. We now have NATO with Finland and Sweden. And they're talking now again about Georgia. And I saw the other day they were talking about one of the former Central Asian Soviet republics. I forget which one it was, but they're talking about putting one of those in NATO. So the neocons intend to escalate this, and unless they lose confidence. So I don't think the neocons would produce a false flag in order to have the Russians act decisively, because their whole success is based on the lack of Russian decisive action. There hasn't been any. Putin wouldn't take Donbass back. It waited 8 years for an army to be built up to attack Donbass. So it intervenes in a very limited and small way that it can't bring to a conclusion. All of these things have built the confidence of the people who hate Russia, who run American foreign policy. And as that confidence builds, the situation gets more dangerous. So now, I may be wrong too. I'm just offering this as a counterpoint to Peter's, which
I think
a valid argument to make. It's a valid
I think
argument.
in the broader scheme of things is that we're all three right. And when we project way, a year or two, 5 years from now. Anyway, go ahead, George.
No, I mean, I just in the few minutes left, I just wonder whether we can just switch gears and ask you, in regard now to the United States political scene. We've seen what's happening to Trump. So 2 questions. Do you think Trump will be allowed to run, or will they stop him from running? And is it possible at all now for Republicans ever to win an election? Is that a mathematical possibility, Republicans ever to win an election ever again? So what do you think?
This is why I like doing podcasts with George, because he gets to the kernel of things right away. Great questions.
Yeah, you two are very good. Well, I don't think it's possible for Republicans to win elections because the majority doesn't matter. The Democrats simply steal them.
Exactly.
The Democrats control.
Damn straight.
The Democrats control the big cities. The big cities are where you have the populations that vote Democrat. And so even if a state is red, like Georgia, Atlanta is blue, and Atlanta is controlled by Democrats. You see what I'm saying? And so they therefore control the election process. And so they count the votes in Atlanta however they want to count them. And they don't count them however they don't want to count them from the rest of the state. The same thing is true in all the states. Like in Arizona, the Democrats have Maricopa County, so they can always win. In Minnesota, they control Minneapolis. In Washington, they control Seattle. In Oregon, they control Portland. You see what I'm saying? In Pennsylvania, they control Philadelphia. Of course, they control New York. So wherever you look, they decide the election. It's like Stalin said, it doesn't matter how you vote, it's who counts the votes. And they count the votes. And now they have proven, having stolen the last 2 elections, that you cannot question that. And if you do, you may actually be arrested for interfering with an election. And they've actually tried to arrest people who have brought hard evidence that the election was stolen. So for that reason, as long as Republicans accept this, they can't win because it'll simply be stolen. It doesn't matter. Trump got more votes the second time than he did the first. Biden ended up with something like 10 or 15 million votes more than Obama, which is impossible. It clearly was stolen. There's no doubt about it. Clearly, the recent elections in Arizona was stolen. There's no doubt about it. But what's happened in the United States is law is weaponized. A Democrat judge votes for Democrats. He rules for Democrats. He doesn't rule for law. Prosecutors prosecute for Democrats. They don't prosecute for law, like this black guy in New York after Trump. George Soros protege. So that's that answer. Now, what about Trump? Well, I think what they're trying to do is to get a state conviction so that he's a felon. Now, and of course they can do that in the state because they're all Democrats. It's all tied up. It's everything. The jury will be Democrats, so they can get a conviction. And it may be overturned, but in the meantime, I don't know if you're a felon, if you're allowed to run for president.
That's a question. I
don't know
don't
the
think you're barred. I don't
I-
think you're barred from running the presidency.
Okay, well then, what they're trying to
But the reputational effect is very important here, and that's part of what they're doing. You can't. Are you going to vote for a convicted felon? That's a pretty powerful bumper sticker.
his supporters will, because they don't believe
Oh,
he's
Right.
so I can walk you through real quickly, if you like, the fraudulent nature of this and what it amounts to. The basic charge is not that Trump paid off the porn star. That's not the charge. The media keeps saying that, but the basic charge is that the expense of paying her off was misreported. It should have been reported as a campaign contribution, but instead it was reported as a company legal expense. Okay, now under New York law, which is the law that this case is developed under, that is a misdemeanor if it's true. Now, that is merely an assumption of the prosecutor. We don't know that it's true. It's his supposition that, well, if it's true, it's a fine. It's not a criminal indictment. It's not a felony. But what the prosecutor did next, he said, now, the reason they reported this as a legal expense was intentional, to hide a campaign contribution. Well, that is a federal felony. But a state has no jurisdiction over federal law and cannot bring a case based on federal law.
But he's kind of, in the indictment, he's sort of changed his position now, because he's now saying it's a violation of New York state law. So he's kind of got away from that ridiculous claim about the federal law. So no, it's a violation of New York state law. I mean, of course, it's idiotic, but I think he's trying to get away from that federal thing.
But George just said it. It's idiotic. Yeah. But as our guest has said, you bring this case to a New York jury, they will convict, as absurd as it sounds. Yeah. I mean, see, this is one of the problems we have. People like us are trying to deal with this rationally and try to understand the law. There's no rationality here. There's no law here. Okay,
that's right.
It will be brought to a jury. He will be convicted. Okay, it's as simple as that. And before that trial starts, he'll be indicted in Washington, D.C. He'll be indicted in Fulton County, Georgia. Right. This is all patently obvious to me.
Yeah. Well, being overdone is one of the reasons it can sink it. Now, any lawyer in New York can challenge this indictment. And let me show you what else is wrong with it. Another thing, even if these charges are true, the statute of limitations has run out. They're too old to be brought. Okay, now another fact. By federal law, U.S. Trump must be provided lifetime with present Secret Service. They can't put the Secret Service in prisons. They can't possibly put them in prison. Now, so I think Peter is right that they're trying to blacken him and create so much controversy that by the time the election comes, people are tired of it and they want to move on. Yeah. And that is probably the real goal, not to put him in jail. If they get a conviction, it's certain to be overturned.
Yeah, but it's interesting you say that, because we got tired of Russiagate, 3 years of Russiagate, but they never got tired of it. They never get tired of their own shenanigans. They'll go on and on. That's right.
The one thing about, it's going to be overturned is that the U.S. Supreme Court, even though Trump has appointed 3 of the justices, they never seem to vote in favor of Trump. So even those justices he put on the bench, there's one law for Trump and there's one law for everyone else. So even the U.S. Supreme Court invariably rules against Trump.
All of those cases with the 2020 election, all across the country, and the Supreme Court was not interested in hearing one of them. Yeah. Not one of them. That is extraordinary.
Yes, I think I can explain that. because Republicans are very protective of America's reputation, and the notion that a presidential candidate stole an election is horrifying. They can't face up to having an election stolen at all. They can much more easily let it be stolen than to come out and say they've stolen an election. The Republicans, they're too protective of the image, and this is image shattering. But you have to understand, if they can arrest Trump on false charges the way they're doing, or do anything to him, every future president is vulnerable. And not only that, every senator, every representative, and eventually the judges themselves. It's just like the South Americans have said, you've been laughing at us for being a banana republic, and now you're the banana republic. Where presidents arrest their predecessors. Every president arrests his predecessor. Well, it makes a joke of politics, or rule of law, or democracy, where the law is weaponized. And so somebody, even the Trump haters, have to realize law is being weaponized, and once it is, it can be used against anybody. It just depends on whose hands it's in.
Yep.
And this, at some point, even the woke law schools and the woke bar associations have to realize that this means the destruction of law. And what is our occupation? We don't have an occupation anymore.
Right. It's funny, there was 100 years that separated the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and Richard Nixon. But since Nixon, there's been what? I think three impeachments in 50 years. So that's, once you started down that path of impeaching, then everyone's going to start impeaching. I mean, Trump was impeached twice. Whoever's the next person, he's going to be impeached. I mean, there's no question. So,
that's right.
But anyway, I think unfortunately our time is up. Paul, that was a fascinating discussion. If only we could have gone on for another few hours. But thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Again, very, very soon. Please.
Very soon.
I hope so. I hope so. I enjoy you too tremendously. This is, it's hard to have a good discussion anymore.
Absolutely.
So call me back.
Thank you.
Okay.
Remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.